Welcome to the CEC Report. It's July 6th. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Lie-BOR Scandal pushes Brits to Glass-Steagall. Week 1 of the Gillard Abbott Carbon Tax. And finally, show me the spot. Syria news is disinformation for war. So first, LIBOR Scandal pushes the Brits to Glass-Steagall. We are witnessing a fascinating development out of London, Craig, out of the City of London, the banking enclave of all places. Some of you, the viewers, might have picked this up on the news. There's a scandal about the LIBOR, the London Interbank Offer Rate, which in effect sets the interest rate for interbank lending worldwide, and how it is set.
It's something like, I was reading about more in detail, Robbie, it's something like $300 trillion of various financial
derivatives and things.
Instruments, not just that, but loans, interbank loans, are actually governed by it. That's $300 trillion. So when they set these official interest rates, it doesn't have to be very much of a difference to make an enormous amount of money illegally in profits.
And also it's the heart. When it's that big, this goes to the heart of the financial system. Craig, this scandal would not have come to light if we were not in 5 years into the greatest financial collapse in history. This is how the City of London always operates. Yeah. There is no free market. The only people who believe in the free market are the people who get fleeced by it, right? It's their way of thinking it's the gods or something.
Which is why for 20 years we've fought this like tooth and nail.
Exactly. They've been doing this for centuries, but this crisis is not a flash in the pan. This is the biggest financial collapse for centuries, what we're going through now. This is the end of the global monetary and economic system. And it's because of that this has come to light, and it's triggered, finally, in Britain, some sanity regarding people saying, hang on, we might have to fundamentally change the system here. Just in terms of the details, before I was reminded, quite a few years ago, Lyndon LaRouche famously said that Adam Smith's so-called hidden hand of the free market is that of the pickpocket who's stealing your wallet. Well, this is an example of that. So far, the scandal has affected Barclays Bank, which is the top British bank, but it's one of a possible 20 that are involved, and who knows, might be more in this. But with Barclays, it goes right to the top. The chairman of Barclays, his name is Marcus Agius. He is an in-law of the Rothschild family. Now, the Rothschild are the very pinnacle, just below the crown on the City of London totem pole.
And they're a crucial element, of course, in the inter-alpha group of banks, which we've been talking about a lot in our publications, that basically represent this financial oligarchy globally.
Well, it's because the inter-alpha, their formation of the inter-alpha group is it's like the running dogs for looting. Yeah. Right. This is a
multiple
deliberate looting operation.
Yeah. Not just in Britain, but across the entire globe.
And Rothschild is also the top of the pecking order of people like George Soros. Like he's a Rothschild entity in terms of what he does around the world. Rothschilds own The Economist magazine, which is the principal, financial journal that everyone in the world sort of takes their cue from. N.M. Rothschild and Sons set the daily gold price, which now that this other setting has come out, then maybe people will question that. So this is the very, very top this goes to, right, with this Barclays Bank chairman. Also, Agius, the chairman, he is the chairman of the British Bankers Association. And the British Bankers Association is the entity responsible for setting the LIBOR. So he chairs that, and his bank is the first one caught out rigging the LIBOR. Now, we said here a few weeks ago, you issued a call for sanctions against the City of London because it's a lawless enclave.
Well, this proves it for sure now.
Well, it does, but people have to understand that up until now it's been protected. Yes. Right? The British Crown and the British Parliament have protected the City of London's status as an untouchable financial entity from which it can loot the world, basically. You know, there's been no regulations are allowed to be imposed on the City of London, and anything to do with the European bailout, the British government's there. You know, when some of these other countries come up with things like taxes on derivatives, most of which go through the City of London, the British government are the ones that say, no, 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 we will not accept those types of things.
Also, the British aren't involved in the European Stability Mechanism, are they?
No.
See, that's interesting. And so everyone else has to suffer by the looting mechanisms of what we call the ESM.
They did more than anyone to set this scam up,
yeah.
But they stepped back so that they can not try and avoid going down with the ship.
So it's their hand going into the other pickpocket's hand. Yeah.
You know. Okay, so here's technically what happened with LIBOR, right? For those who don't know the details. LIBOR is the interbank rate. The daily lending that banks do to each other, overnight lending, has been the major source of liquidity for the world financial system for decades, and it's short-term money. And this was like a big washing machine of money that before the GFC erupted in 2008, this was really cheap money, and it was funding everything right around the world. But there's a daily rate of interest that gets set. Now, instead of setting that interest rate as an average of actually charged interest rate, so instead of saying, the LIBOR people, instead of saying to the banks who are involved in this, okay, what are you charging? They say to them, give us a quote, basically of what you want to charge. So the rate that the LIBOR quotes has not been what's actually been charged, it's what these banks have wanted the public to think that they are charging, and they could set it. Barclays could quote a rate that was, and did quote rates that were entirely beneficial to Barclays. And as you said, when you're dealing with hundreds of trillions of dollars based on this, slightest little incremental changes in this rate can skim a lot of money off for Barclays, and that's what they were doing. And they've always done this. Now, they call it, in terms of the derivatives, they call it the reference rate for over 350 trillion in interest rate derivatives. Something like 90% of all US mortgages and commercial loans use it as a reference rate. There's an article in the Australian press yesterday that our way of setting interbank lending in Australia, Craig, doesn't appear to have these problems because our particular mechanism is different. On the other hand, Australia is so dependent on massive foreign borrowings that ultimately comes from, that is all affected by the LIBOR rate. So we are right in the middle of this as well. Now, but this could be the last straw because there has been a development in Britain. There's a chorus of British voices who are now specifically calling for Glass-Steagall. Tell the viewers what's happening.
Well, this is absolutely phenomenal, Robbie, because as you know, Lyndon LaRouche has been calling for a Glass-Steagall International. We've been campaigning on it for a long time now because a Glass-Steagall is the model used by Roosevelt to separate out the legitimate banking system from the speculative banking system. Now, what happened specifically in Britain was in 2000, after the global financial crisis, they set up an independent commission on banking, which was headed up by a bloke by the name of Sir John Vickers, and he came out with a Vickers report, which again was this is how the Parliament is used to protect the banks, and the idea was to ring fence the speculative assets from the so-called, the more important assets like mortgages and so. Ring fence.
Not drive them apart.
No.
Just put a little fence between them.
But what's happened is, as the nature of these things is, that you can't have the fox guarding the hen house and expect the hens not to be disappearing, right? Yeah. Well, that's what's happened. The system breaks down. The government's weakened the laws, so-called, for this ring fencing, and consequently, you've had some very significant members of the financial establishment and the actual establishment in Britain come out and call for actually Glass-Steagall.
Full-blown Glass-Steagall.
Yeah. So on Channel 4 last week, a guy by the name of Lord Miners came out. Now, who's he? Well, Paul Miners was appointed the Financial Services Secretary under Gordon Brown, and he became a peer of the realm because he wasn't a member of Parliament. But he specifically said, and I will agree with, I'll read what he says in response to the fact that the Vickers ring fencing had collapsed. He said, yes, I do agree with that. I think the evidence of the last few weeks, and Diamond himself, this is a guy who was...
Diamond is the chief executive of Barclays.
That's correct. He was giving evidence. Himself said that many of the problems that emerged in Barclays were within the ring fence as envisaged. Now the government has already diluted the ring fence that was proposed by Vickers, but the ring fence doesn't go far enough. We need to go with what is known as a Glass-Steagall model, which is a complete separation. Now, this wasn't just one voice. This was then reported again by the Financial Times, which is the establishment paper for the oligarchy in Britain, calling for a Glass-Steagall. So this is a sea change, Robbie. The situation's got so bad now that they can see the entire system evaporating before their eyes, that you've got an important faction within Britain now saying we've got to have the Glass-Steagall.
And the Age and Sydney Morning Herald here ran a Guardian article from over there explicitly calling for Glass-Steagall as well. So this is quite significant, and Lyndon LaRouche has jumped on this, Craig, overnight, noting that this development in Britain is a very real chance that between the Brits and America, this might actually happen, because the two times that Glass-Steagall has come up to the US Congress as a law, previously the British have threatened the United States that if
Causes belly.
it would be casus belli for war, that they would regard that as a fundamental attack on them. Now there's a change of tune because this is such a comprehensive collapse. Anyway, so we will monitor those developments quite carefully. We're going to have to go to a break now. When we come back, we're going to talk about week 1 of the Gillard Abbott Carbon Tax. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So, it is now week 1 of the Gillard Abbott Carbon Tax. You might be thinking, or you wouldn't be thinking, the viewers might be thinking, what? The Abbott Carbon Tax? What do you mean the Abbott Carbon Tax?
What about the Turnbull Carbon Tax, Robbie?
Oh, well, listen, we have a limited amount of time on this show.
Okay, righto, sorry.
We could be at this all day. Let's pick on Abbott because he deserves it. There's a reason we're talking about this, and it's because of you, the viewer. You've got to wise up. Yes, Tony Abbott has pledged in blood that he'll repeal the carbon tax, etc.
Well, that's why I said Turnbull, Robbie, because the thing about politics is at the moment
Shifting sands.
Shifting sands. The face in front of people is Abbott, but if Turnbull, who's already very campaigned for a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme, gets the nod, you're not going to see the demise of the carbon tax. This is all just the ruse for the public.
And I would question, even if Turnbull doesn't and Abbott does take power, whether you would see the demise of the carbon tax.
Well,
this is what people have to... Since Hawke and Keating, there has not been a proper two-party system in Australia. The two-party system has been a ruse. It's played the population to keep us swinging. It's what Julia Gillard called the post-1983 consensus on economic reform. Viewers may know this, but if you don't, know this. In Tony Abbott's own book, he wrote this like a war manual when he before he became the opposition leader. He put out a book. He talked there about an ETS and a carbon tax because, of course, he voted for an ETS in the Howard government when just before they lost power. In that book, in Abbott's book, he says explicitly that the best way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions is through a carbon tax. This is something he's argued for. He doesn't necessarily believe in global warming, but that's beside the point. The carbon tax is not about global warming. No. It's about looting the population to prop up a bankrupt financial system. And Abbott is as much a servant of the financial system as Julia Gillard. And next week I'm going to have more on their similarities in other areas. I would say that there's a lot of people around Australia that have been totally opposed to this. The main force that has undermined the opposition to the carbon tax and the whole global warming scam is the Liberal Party of Australia under Tony Abbott. How can we say that? They do not oppose it on principle. They oppose it on political opportunism. So they don't question the methodology of the arguments. They don't question the free market garbage language that it's all posed in, because they all believe all that.
Well, go back to 2007, Robbie. We put out 540,000 papers on the whole idea that
it's a fraud.
It's a fraud. You know, the whole idea of carbon pollution is a fraud. Now, at that time, there was no institutional opposition.
None.
to the garbage that Al Gore was coming down and promoting in this country. We crystallised that. We did that through 540,000 copies of our paper, but we also mass distributed as many as we could and encouraged people to distribute the Great Global Warming Swindle, which put the opposition to the carbon tax into the public arena. Now this created a groundswell of support. We were on the very first Q&A type.
Well, we turned around public opinion because it was totally in carbon tax favour. Keep going.
And this led to a backlash, which actually saw Tony Abbott defeat Turnbull because of the enormous amount of response, emails and so forth, hitting members of Parliament that Abbott was actually to be elected. But we did that.
But Craig, wouldn't you say that the change that Abbott led in the Liberal Party was not because they were convinced that global warming was garbage, it was about their survival?
That's right, purely pragmatic and purely riding the crest of the wave, let the public opinion after a bit of time die down, but we end up with the same policies. What you're saying about the consensus idea, it's amazing how these incredibly disgusting policies get brought up, and through the yin-yang of politics, what you end up with, regardless of the Liberal or the Labor, you end up with the same disgusting policies.
Well, and contrast, just give the viewers an insight into our thinking, and you're the leader of the CEC. 2007, when we put out that paper, 540,000 copies, something like 80% of the Australian population thought addressing climate change was the #1 political issue. So we were totally in the minority. What was our thinking in doing something that on the surface would have been so unpopular?
Because the principle, Robbie, that this was designed for population reduction. This was a global policy pushed by the City of London financiers to create, through the carbon tax, a means of taxing the population again. It's not the money that they're concerned about, it's actually population reduction. And as Prince Philip himself has said, Hans Schellenhuber, who came down to Melbourne, said they want to reduce the world's population from 7 billion down to 1 billion. So what do? Is you tax a gas like carbon dioxide that's actually a productive gas for the development of photosynthesis and so forth. Green plant life relies on carbon dioxide. It's not a pollutant, but by taxing it, you create the ability of shutting down industry, putting industry under enormous pressures. Look what's happening in for example, in the electricity industry here in Victoria and Australia as a whole. We're losing massive investment into electricity because of the carbon tax. There is no future in being able to invest in this because it's a complete unknown. So what happens is we're going to be facing brownouts and even blackouts in this state because we're losing so much electricity generating capacity. You can't produce a power plant overnight. It takes many years to build them. So you have to have a lot of foresight. And this is what's happening globally, where we have these sorts of hideous policies.
So we just came out and told this truth, whatever the public thought of it or not.
That's what we do as an organisation, Robbie. We're in some cases, we're way ahead of the curve in terms of popular opinion. And we actually help shape the opposition to this when people started to realise that they didn't quite smell things, that the things were correct. And they actually then now what you find is that 60%, 66% I think in the last poll, oppose the carbon tax.
And it's dropping like a stone in the last few weeks. So let that be a warning to the Australian public. If you vote for someone who tells you what you want to hear, rather than the truth, you cannot guarantee the results, and that's what the risk we run with Abbott and Gillard. Stop swinging, vote for the CEC. All right, finally, when we come back, we're going to talk about the propaganda about Syria. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, show me the spot. Syria news is disinformation for war. So just an update on the Syria crisis since we last talked about it, because this crisis in Syria is the most immediate trigger for a world war, the way it's a standoff between the Anglo-Americans and the Russians and Chinese. Turkey, on behalf of the Anglo-Americans, undertook an actual provocation, which was sending their jet into Syrian airspace, and there's been a flow-on from that, which is all over the news. And of course, it's being spun to make it look like Turkey are the victims of Syria shooting down their pilots. On the 30th of June, more importantly, there was a meeting in Geneva of all the sort of countries that are involved, in which a communique was issued, and that communique called on all parties in the Syrian conflict, all parties, to stop the violence and negotiate. The problem is, when this gets reported in the press, it's all lies, literally all lies. Before I give you some predicates of that, I want to cast people's mind back. Look, we're a decade into regime change, the regime change agenda. We're a decade into the...
They start off with the coloured revolutions.
Coloured revolutions. Yeah.
In Europe.
The whole Iraq thing based on a lie. You know, we've had so many lies, right, about everything, global warming. Mm-hmm. But people, it's like they've lost their skepticism. You know, or they get it back and then they lose it again, because, you know, you think after Iraq no one would believe these bastards anymore, but they do. Cast your mind back. In 1846, the President of the United States at that time was named James Polk, and he ordered a war against Mexico. He asked the US Congress to authorize him to go to war because he said that US soldiers had been killed by Mexican soldiers on US soil, and this was the base of a big push for war. The Congress authorised that war, but great people that historically we know to be great leaders like John Quincy Adams, the former president, voted no. Now, he was a Whig, and his fellow Whig, whose name was Abraham Lincoln, and in a state legislator, also led a campaign against this. And Lincoln gave a very important speech at the time, very famous, in which he said, he demanded of Polk, quote, "Show me the spot," end quote, where these American soldiers had been killed. In other words, we're not going to believe what you say, you prove it, right? And that's what's been lost here, Craig. So in the case of Syria, we need to revive it today. The ones who are trying are the Russians. On this communique, London, the Brits, under William Hague, have come out saying the communique calls for Assad to go. The Syrian opposition forces, who themselves are now being caught out torturing children, etc., they're claiming we want to follow the Geneva communique, but we will not negotiate until Assad goes. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has stood up and said, hang on a minute, this communique says nothing of the kind. And the way he put it is, the Geneva agreements should not be distorted in any way. That's his demand. In the Russian Duma, which is their parliament, Alexei Pushkov, chairman of the State Duma's Foreign Affairs Committee, he calls it a war of interpretation. He said, the agreement does not say a word about Assad's resignation, that is not mentioned at all in it. So the Brits are trying to claim that there's a consensus in the West that he should go, and that's the condition, and it's not. But the Syrian opposition are being manipulated by the Brits to, you know, become an obstacle here. So, Craig, if the British wanted peace, why would they lie?
Well, I think you've just proven the case, Robbie. The fact is it's all lies. The intention is to weaken or to destroy Russia in that region. Russia's not going to allow that to happen because Russia has bases and certain Middle East interests in that area, and consequently, you know, Russia is not going to back down. And I think people really have to understand what the issue is. In our last paper we've just put out, we've gone through this in detail, how the intention of the British is to foment nuclear war if they can't get their own way. In terms of there's a rapid financial crisis going on, and Russia and China are in a sense standing up for that by asserting their own national sovereignty. So people should get a copy of this paper and read more about what we are actually saying about this in detail.
And we don't have time to talk about it a lot. We have to leave it there. But it's just we have to remind people of the truth of what's going on in these situations. So that's it for the CEC report. Tune in next week for more.